So welcome everybody. Thank you, community members, regardless of your political, ideological, cultural, ethnic, gender, or other affiliations. You are all welcome here. Thank you all very much. This is our second day for the labor studies class. So a few themes and questions that I want to bring up here. Most of the history that we teach is often very fragmented, and I want to make the very strong assertion that basically all history is labor history. Right? One of my students mentioned, well, when was the first strike in all history? Let me give you a quick story. Those of you who read the Bible, right there in Exodus, you might actually read the story of Exodus as a labor struggle, right? Pharaoh is management, let's say. And the Jewish people, the Israelites, let my people go, are the striking or aggrieved workers. So this is a way to interpret history. So you could go all the way back at the very beginning, a very tough book to read, Exodus. All of history, all of historical struggles can also be seen as class struggles, and this is a point we'll bring up later on. Labor rights, the rights of workers, the rights of those who carry on the work of our society, are also civil rights to carry on commerce, to exchange with people, to actually have the same rights, to sit where you want, to spend your money. These are civil rights. So civil rights and labor rights go hand in hand here. We also don't want to fragment off women's history as some special class that you take where there's only about 20 students and Nicholas is the only guy in the class. No, all history is also women's history, and women's history is working history, because who cleans the pots? Who cooks the food? Who cares for the children? And who were the first factory workers in America? Women, the textile mills. Very good. Question that I'm going to bring up today: how are labor and race interconnected, especially in this very early period of labor history? We're going to see a lot of connections between the idea of race and labor, and we're going to try to point those out. And we're going to try to look at this idea: how did American culture, our individualism, our Protestantism, our focus on hard work, how did that affect labor organizing, and labor struggles throughout this period of time? And we might try to tackle this big, broad question: why is labor relatively weak? And it is relatively weak in the United States compared to other developed countries. Why is that? History will give us a little bit of an idea into the answer to some of these questions. So let's launch right in. Early colonial labor, what did it look like? Right around about 3/4 of all of the earliest Anglo or white settlers, they're not white yet, in Jamestown Colony were what's called indentures. Indentured servitude was sort of a slavery light. It was a brief slavery. It was how you paid for your passage over. So you indentured yourself for about 5 to 7, sometimes longer, to a master, and you were called a servant. So this was the dominant form of labor. This is how the Jamestown Colony brought in all of its tobacco. We're not talking cotton yet. We're talking tobacco at this period of time. And what you see here is a little snippet of an indenture document. Many of the people who would become indentured, they couldn't read. They had this written for them. And most indentures came from various what we might call middle or lower classes in Britain, sometimes orphans, the poor, because in Britain at this time the population was sort of skyrocketing and the surplus population was being sent to the new colonies. So in the United States, the early United States, indentured servitude was somewhere close to 75% of the labor force. This included debt servitude, which was enforced through various forms of violence. As I mentioned before, this was our first form of labor in the United States. And like I mentioned, tobacco is the main crop. Cotton doesn't catch on until much later in the United States when we sort of have a shift from tobacco to cotton, but tobacco is the main cash crop. So tobacco workers, indentured Anglos, Irish, Scotch, some French, and some early skilled workers from Poland, from Greece, are also sort of smattered in there, and they don't get talked about too much. One idea. When was the first strike in the United States? I said biblically maybe what was one of the first strikes, but the first strike in the United States happened in this very important year in Jamestown in 1619. And as I mentioned, these were Polish glass workers, right? Skilled tradesmen who were denied the right to vote in the House of Burgesses. So what did they do? Well, they just went home and said, you know, oh, this country does not like us. No, no, no. The Polish, they couldn't have walked home over the Atlantic. No, what the Polish workers did, they refused to work, right? They refused to work and they struck. And what happened? The House of Burgesses immediately ordered the enfranchisement, the right to vote for these Polish workers. Now, you got to remember, these were all male, all white, and they were all right. The strike against the Polish workers is that they were Catholics, and the new colony was overwhelmingly dominated by different forms of Protestantism. And I kind of make this question: if they were not European, if they had not been skilled, if they had not been male, if they had not been white, would the outcome of this very early right to vote, would it have been different? I think so. And part of my evidence for that is one of the next things that happened in Jamestown, a very important occurrence in 1619, and that's the first arrival of Africans in the New World. Excuse me, the first arrival of Africans in the English colonies. The New World Africans had already been here as slaves in South America. So this is where labor and race begin their long relationship, and really my argument is they never break that relationship. Labor and race are always intertwined. This is an engraving of the arrival of the first Africans off of a Portuguese man-of-war. No, it was a Dutch man-of-war, sorry. And they arrived in the Jamestown colony. Now in the documents they're referred to as servants, which was the English term for these indentures. But when we look at some of the historical documentation, they were treated a little different, much longer sentences in indenture, and several historians say yes, they were slaves. The important issue though with the intercourse between the first whites and blacks is that this is not quite the classic slavery that we know in the 17th and 18th century, and I'll show you how that develops over this time. So basically Africans were treated as other indentured servants, a little bit worse, a little bit worse. So they worked beside whites, they had intercourse, in the biblical sense, with other whites. So these restrictions against these miscegenation laws didn't exist at this time. Socialized, loved Anglos, they escaped together and they rebelled together in this early colonial period. Now, as the Jamestown colony grows, we have some wonderful stories about Jamestown. There's cannibalism. Jamestown is a wonderful, well, wonderful in a theoretical sense, horrible in a moral sense, but really it's a fabulously interesting case. Bodies were being dug up and eaten. One man cooked his wife's head in garlic. Very interesting. But what was happening, though, as the Jamestown colonists overcame these problems, their military strength grew, and they expanded their colony at the expense of the native population, right? So Powhatan, who was they named him king, he was just a local chief, he was losing land to the Jamestown colonists who betrayed, attacked him, raided his corn. And the planters, the big planters, the chief class, the ruling class of the early colony, took more and more land, first at the expense of the natives, but also at the expense of the yeoman farmer. So these farmers were becoming squeezed. They couldn't find the good land to grow their tobacco on, so they had resentment towards the ruling class. Anger was growing among servants and farmers at this time. And something very strange happened. Conditions improved in Great Britain, and servants became more scarce. They heard about the harsh indentures in the New World, and they were like, best let's stay over here, governor. So they, and slaves started African slaves started to become more common. And as we approach the 1760s and 1770s, revolts of slaves and revolts of indentured servants become more and more common, and it sort of culminates in what we call Bacon's Rebellion. We have Nathaniel Bacon and Governor Berkeley here, and this began as this elite squabble. Nathaniel Bacon said, here, I want to raid some Indian land. We need some more Indian land for our yeoman farmers. But pretty soon, and the governor said, no, come on, Bacon, we have to maintain peace. We've raided them a lot. I want some peace here. And Bacon said no. But what eventually happened was that Bacon said, hey, poor whites, poor indentured servants, black servants, come on up here. Let's all raid the plantations of these rich planters. And what they did was they raided Jamestown. So it was an interracial struggle between, on the one hand, Bacon and poor whites and enslaved blacks on the one hand, and the planter aristocracy on the other. So it kind of became the world's first what we call black and white freedom struggle. So African slaves and English servants basically took up arms together to fight the Jamestown ruling class. This was defeated very sadly. Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery, a very common ailment at the time. But the defeat of Bacon's Rebellion, which was an interracial class struggle, had sort of far-reaching consequences. And the consequences of the defeat of Bacon's Rebellion, you can read some of this, especially in the great history by the Yale historian Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom, is that American slavery became institutionalized, and it became the dominant form of labor in the agrarian areas of the country. So the planter aristocracy said, these indentures are too dangerous to be kept next to our black slaves. We're going to forget about indentured servants, right, these po whites, and we're going to concentrate our energy on recruiting black slaves. So they reduced the use of indenture and increased the use of black slave labor, and it becomes the norm approximately after 1680. And then from about 1680 to, what's the year? 1865, we have a permanent class of unfree black laborers. So remember, these are laborers, right? We don't just say, oh, they're just blacks, they're just Africans. No, this is part of the working class, which was cut down the middle, or cut down this way, laterally, and the bottom half of the working class was basically enslaved along color lines. The former servants, the former indentures, gain privileges, gain many privileges. One of these privileges had to do with, there were miscegenation laws, but also one privilege was if you were a poor white and you caught a black slave escaping, you would receive almost a year's wages. So for these poor white indentures, poor white servants, this was a windfall of profits, windfall of gain. Black slaves who were caught escaping were punished harshly, losing a leg. White servants were flogged. I don't know about you, I don't want to be flogged either, but it's certainly better than losing a leg. And around in the 17th century, that constitutes much better treatment. In 1705 in Virginia, slaves are assigned the status of real estate by the Virginia Black Codes. In New York, a law against runaway slaves assigns the death penalty for those caught over 40 miles north of Albany. Massachusetts then declares marriage between African Americans and whites to be illegal. So slavery and the codes against black and white cooperation are entrenched very harshly. And many historians, many social scientists say this is really the invention of the R word. This is now racism. So it's a political and ideological tool to divide working classes. And we then have the practice and the ideology of white supremacy. The white workers get the idea, we're better. We're better than those slaves. And we will help the colonial aristocracy to keep them in their place. So slavery and race, I consider it's a labor problem. It isn't a cultural problem. It's not, it's so deep in our culture. No, it's a labor problem. It's a problem of who is going to work in the most harsh, dirtiest, and low-paying jobs, and who is going to have the relatively more privileged positions in the economy. That's what race is. It's not about culture. It's not about, who called me an N or who called me a cracker. It's about who holds power in the economy. And these are sort of some famous images of slavery. And the very harsh work. This is eventually does become cotton agriculture. Again, slavery and race, a labor problem. More images. These are images taken from much closer. Remember, there's no photography in 1675. These are images from much closer to the Civil War, right? But rather than giving you drawings, they are images. So when you look at these images, this is part of the working class. This is part of labor history, not just part of, this is part of black history. No, over here. This is part of labor history. This is how the laboring classes were divided in colonial America. So early guilds and trade associations. I thought this was a nice little picture here. A female woodworker here. In 1770s, so long after the institution of slavery divides the working class, the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia is founded. In 1778, journeyman printers in New York. These are associations. They don't hold the power of unions. They're like they were sort of weak trade guilds, much more like guilds from the medieval period, where stone cutters or stonemasons would join together, and there were apprentices and journeymen and masters. And some labor unions retain some of those craft differences. In 1792, this is one thing in labor studies, you got to get used to a lot of acronyms. Acronyms are everywhere, right? So the Federal Society of Journeymen, of journeyman cordwainers. A cordwainer comes from the word cordovan. It just means sort of a type of leather. So the FSJC, you know, salute the FSJC. Doesn't sound so good, huh? But basically, shoemakers had this society in 1792. And what did they do with this society? They tried to raise some of the, better at least, the wages and the working conditions of some of the workers. All right, now let's move on to much closer to the Revolution. That's an engraving from the period of the Boston Massacre. And what's going on close to the Revolution? So see, we've already gone 200 years of history. Woo! 200 years, not bad booty. So sailors, these working class sailors in the coastal ports coined the term strike. And what was it? The sailors were very militant at the time. What they did, they coined the term strike. It was they struck the flag. The sails. They struck the sails. And the sails came down and they said, Captain, we ain't going no further till we've got another barrel of rum and a better day's pay. Right? Right? Right. So sailors, militant sailors, coined this term to strike. So they struck or they took down their sails. It was a refusal to work, right? It was a refusal to work. And there's several books about this. It's really interesting to read about these coastal cities like New York and Boston along the docks, right? Sort of like along the waterfront from the 50s. Along the docks, there were these multiracial bands of sailors, black, white, West Indian, Indian, teeming on the docks. And they were rabble-rousers. Maybe you have these images of pirates, but they were real rabble-rousers. And these groups of people made up the early American revolutionaries. We think of George Washington and Jefferson, but it was these rabble-rousing sailors and dock workers who were the driving force, and that's who got killed in the Boston Massacre. Because they got really harshly hit by the British taxes, and what was happening, British soldiers were taking their jobs. So somebody like Crispus Attucks, the first man, he was multiracial, half black, half Indian. He was the first man killed in the American Revolution at the Boston Massacre. So see what I'm saying again? Race and labor go hand in hand, right? Race and labor go hand in hand. Play a strong role in the revolution. Caution, conspiracy theory coming up here. Early after the revolution, see, there's a lot I'm skipping, but that's your responsibility to go familiarize yourself with every little detail of the revolution. Not my responsibility, right? But the early, around 1800, a couple of decades after the consolidation of the United States, we have the conspiracy theory of labor, right? So the courts found that the cordwainers, right, the good old FSJC, they struck for higher pay in 1806. They were arrested, they were charged, and they were convicted, and they were fined $8. That was about, I think, a week's pay for coming together, in concert for mutual support. Workers here were found guilty simply, this is from one historian, simply because they have united for mutual advantage. So if workers united for mutual advantage, that was considered a conspiracy. And the conspiracy theory of labor, or the conspiracy law theory of labor, was from about 1806 till about 1842. There was a little change in the law, but actually the courts retained the ability to pull that out of their pocket. Conspiracy, boom. They still retain that, but it was left up to the judges. left up to the judges. So in 1842, there was a little change in the law. Sort of what's happening on the economic industrial front. One invention that comes along where capital replaces labor is the spinning jenny. And this happens, Hargreaves comes up with this in England, and he replaces about 8 hand weavers, right? All the weaving was being done by hand. He replaces 8 hand weavers, and this is the origin of this group called the Luddites. Anyone heard of the Luddites? No? A few. What do the Luddites do? Wreck machines, Joe?
I don't know if it was them, but I do remember that. Yeah, they'd like throw their shoes into it.
Throw their shoes,
yeah,
you know.
That's where the term sabotage comes from. Because back in the day, when the Dutch were wearing those wooden shoes, you throw a wooden shoe into a spinning jenny, it wrecks it.
Throw a wooden shoe into that, it'll screw it up.
Sabotage.
So the shoe was called a sabbat, sabotage. Throw the shoe in there, wreck the machine. So those 8 weavers, those 8 hand weavers, they were all out of a job when Hargrave came up with his spinning jenny. So this was sort of like the very first modern labor protest was to destroy the machines. But the machines persisted anyway and made production much more efficient, much faster, which is a good thing, right? That's a good thing. Other inventions that really ramped up this industrial revolution was, you know, good old, from 6th grade, right? Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. So we got the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, and then the organization of production was the factory system. It used to be this thing called the putting out system, where I'd give Carmen and Devin and Margaret, you know, a little piece, and they'd take it home to their own house, and they'd sew me some stuff, and, you know, I'd say, Mr. Moneybags, come to collect my, you know, come to collect my weaving. I'm not giving my 20s away. Margaret, my dollar back, please. You know, thank you. You know, I give you 100. You know. So the putting out system was the factory owner would collect his put out merchandise from the houses of the workers. Now the factory system agglomerated all of this work into one place, and our little nimble fingers of the all-female workforce was now spinning and weaving inside of these big houses, which eventually became known as factories. And all of these, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, boosted production. Now what happened in the US? That drives cotton demand up in the north because of industry. And in the south said, because it's a market, right? The market worked. Give the market a hand there. The market worked. There was demand for cotton. It was more easily produced, and the demand for cotton, the southern slave owners responded to the invisible hand, and they expanded slavery vastly. And the northern industry grew enormously. So slavery, some people argue slavery was on its last legs in the 1790s, but the cotton gin and the spinning jenny and the Industrial Revolution gave slavery a new life, life anew. And this is a great engraving. It's also on Edmund Morgan's book of slaves spinning the cotton in the larger, not spinning, but using the cotton gin. So these are, remember, these are workers, right? Don't think, oh, slave. The slave means a worker, right? So this is part of the labor movement. Very important for slavery and for labor studies in general is the idea of slave revolts. The slave revolts are also labor revolts, right? Now there are many of them. I don't have time to go into everything, but a few highlights of slave revolts. There was one, New York in 1712. Africans and several Indians seized guns tried to seize a ship to the West, to the West Indies. They were caught. Almost everybody in the group was hanged. That's how almost all of these rebellions, almost everyone is caught and killed. The Stono Rebellion, which was in South Carolina, 1739. Also, what's happening in these rebellions, black slaves would seize weaponry, usually a very skilled tradesman among the slaves who is very intelligent, very skilled, would plan for years these rebellions, and they all get killed. Famous one, Gabriel, or the wrongly named Gabriel Prosser, but Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, this was all of these rebellions strike fear into the planter aristocracy, and what do? Each time they respond with more and more force against the slaves. Slave patrols are made much worse. The Denmark Vesey rebellion. Gabriel Prosser, or Gabriel, was a carpenter. Denmark Vesey was, Vesey was a carpenter, Gabriel was a blacksmith. So these are skilled tradesmen leading the rest of the slaves. Famous one, Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831. Nat Turner, a rare one who could read, rare slave worker who could read. He was reading in the Bible, and he said he had a revelation. God visited him and said, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And that his mission was to free the slaves. And in response to every one of these rebellions, the slave system got harsher, more slave patrols, more armaments, harsher punishments to control a labor system. This is an engraving of Nat Turner's capture. What's happening in the North? That's always the question, right? The North, these are of course pictures from about the 19-teens, but in the North the textile manufacturers spreads enormously. What do you notice about the people in some of these pictures, folks? Children, young women. Very small children. The small children were hired at the lowest wages to crawl into the machines, if you can still see me, crawl under the machines and to clean out all the cotton from outside, all those little droppings. And sometimes they would get caught in the machines, arms would be ripped off, and guess what they did? They then filed a unfair labor practice. No. They filed a workplace injury report. Right? They filed a workplace injury report, right? No, they took workers' comp and just sat on their asses for a year, right? No, they got killed, and that was it, right? There was nothing. There was no such thing as those things. And the children were paid the least. Women were also paid totally different sets of wages than men, even if they were doing the same work. Oh boy, let's see, can Northern labor organize? Can it organize? Well, I got another hat for that. I don't know why it's kind of a cowboy hat, but kind of matches the vest the most. In about the 1820s and 30s, Northern labor has its first sort of recognizable unions in a couple of trades, right? One thing, the picture is from the Seattle strikes of the 19-teens. I'm sorry I don't have any pictures of the 1820s. They were hard to find. There's very little, there was no photography, I think, at that time. In Philadelphia in 1827, there was the Mechanics Union of Trades Associations, and the interesting thing that they did was that they formed a little working men's party, and this working men's party advocated for labor reform, a reduction in work hours. Work hours around the 1820s and 30s were roughly in the area of 10 to 14 hours. Could be 10, could be 12, could be 4. Yeah, Lori, don't look at me like,
That's supposed to be in 1827 or 1827?
Oh, very good. 1827, typo, 1827. We're not even getting to 1927 today. Thank you. Mistake, dummy mistake. Yes, 1827. See, folks, that's the mark of a smart student. So 1827. But the one history that I read on that is that this working men's organization was soon co-opted into the Democratic Party, and it sort of lost its effectiveness. The Democratic Party around this time was sort of attempting to be the white working men's party, right? It was pro-slavery, anti-immigrant, but it was for the white working men. So again, the RACE issue comes up. In 1835, there was a general strike. A general strike is where all the workers of many trades come together and they refuse to work. So the 1835 Philadelphia general strike, and this was really driven by Irish coal miners, Irish coal heavers, in fact, advocating for a 10-hour workday, and it was a success. It was a success. See, this is the interesting thing about American labor history, and American history in general, is that many ethnic groups are sort of specially concentrated in some occupations and in some industries. So now we're ramping up. Remember, we're still in the 19th century, the 1800s. We're chugga, chugga, chugga coming up to the Civil War. This is just, I thought, a pretty picture of Northern soldiers, Northern officers coming up to the Civil War. Why am I putting the Civil War in a labor studies, labor history class? Because it's very important. Civil War and labor really match up well together. What we have, in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, we have basically two competing ruling classes, right? The Northern industrial capitalist bourgeoisie, you could say that, and the Southern plantation capitalists or bourgeoisie. So two ruling classes, right? Southern plantation owners, Northern industrialists. They cooperated, but they also disliked each other, and they were encroaching on each other's power structures. They were competing in the national legislature over which states would be free, which states would be slave, and it was getting into a very heated debate. And you can take whole classes on Civil War, right? On the causes and consequences. We're spending a few minutes. The important thing is that slavery, the slave system, degraded what's called free wage labor, right? So, in fact, slavery, so you can think of it this way. Slavery, the slave system, degraded the wages often of free whites. Right, so free whites were actually hurt by the slave system. Why? Massa, the masters would sometimes rent out their slaves that were very highly skilled at lower wages than the skilled white workers. So one way of undermining, and of course the Massa would keep all the profits. Very few, if any, of those wages would go back to sometimes a little bit of wages could be, I have read it, that could be gained by the slave. But one way in which slave labor undermined free wage labor. Also, whites at this time, white working class people, were really hoping for free soil. They were hoping to go, go west, young man, go west. Well, that's a YMCA song. But they were really hoping to go west, right? And to take lands and to live a better life than out east in those factories. So for the white working class and for some free blacks, the hope was to move west, get free soil where there was no slavery and no plantation owners who were going to grab it up. And that was a freedom from the oppression in the east. slaveholders wanted to expand westward and stop free labor, free soil, because they wanted those lands to become slave lands and to become slave states and expand the political power of the South. So the white working class in the North and the slaveocracy in the South, they were fighting too. So it was the upper class of the South and the working class of the North had a big fight coming. Southern planters and Northern workers were both politically and economically at odds. It was a real threat. And the abolitionist movement took a lot of power in the Northern working class. Not all. It's not all a wonderful story. The Northern white working class was often very racist, would attack Irish. There were numerous Northern race riots, even under the auspices of different trade unions and trade associations. And that's kind of one of the shames of the labor movement. You know, there's lots of warts. There's some terrible ethnicism and racism. So you know, even the whites that joined the abolitionist movement are not stain free. Many of them thought that, oh, we should abolish slavery and ship all Africans back to Africa. So you have to see all of this in its complexity and in its subtlety. It's not just one, oh yeah, Northern working men, that's great, versus Southern slave owners. We finished that one. No, it's not that easy. But two great heroes, John Brown. If you noticed on the way in, I played the battle hymn of the Republic, which is John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his truth keeps marching on. And his truth was the Northern Army of working class whites and later 200,000 free and formerly enslaved blacks entering the South to crush the oppressive labor system of the South. And his sort of later ally, you can't call Frederick Douglass an ally, another advocate of abolition, emancipation, and the fighting of blacks in the Civil War on the side of the North, Frederick Douglass, another great supporter. So the Civil War abolishes a extremely oppressive form of labor. You're kind of thinking about it like this. Every ruling class is attached to a particular type of production. And the type of production that the Southern ruling class was attached to was, oppressive agricultural production. That form of economy had to be gotten rid of in order to free African Americans. So it's very much an economic struggle, very much an economic struggle here. After the Civil War, I'm jumping just a couple of years, we have this thing called Reconstruction. Reconstruction, everyone probably fell asleep in that. I was asleep in that day in class, Mr. Budimir. But Reconstruction was really important because it was a strategic time in American history to sort of fix the problem of race and labor. To fix the problem of race and labor. So Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction by Republicans, right? The radical friends of black labor were the Republicans, and they instituted Reconstruction. And this was a massive military occupation of the South, forcing the planters and their military arms out, disenfranchising them. And there were more blacks elected to legislatures during Reconstruction than there are today, despite Barack Obama. Yep, there were more blacks in legislatures and in elected offices than there were today. At least the last time I checked, which was probably about 6 years ago. So, you could say, oh, things have changed in 6 years, Nicholas. Really, there was a vast protection of democracy in the South. It was probably one of the, some historians say, the most democratic time in the South ever under radical Reconstruction. Black labor organizations organized under the protection of Northern forces and pushed for higher wages. Right? And sometimes there was even white and black interracial organizing in this period. Unfortunately, there was this wonderful little close presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and I forget Tilden's first name. If anyone remembers, let me know. But the Hayes v. Tilden election, you know, I know we all voted in that one. In Hayes v. Tilden, Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican, and the party of emancipation. And in order to secure the election for Hayes, the Democrats, right, the party of white supremacy in the South, said, we'll let Hayes go if you cease Reconstruction in the South. And they said yes. So the Northern Republican Party abandons blacks and allows reaction and the planter aristocracy, right, the ruling class of the South, to return and to resubjugate blacks over the next 20 years. So planter rule after 1877 comes sort of back with a vengeance. So we allow, because of the downfall of Reconstruction, we allow the re-enslavement of the South. Man I studied under at Wayne State, Michael Goldfield, says this about the period. White leaders failed to understand the importance of the labor struggle around Reconstruction in the South and the degree to which the Democratic Party was the party of racism and reaction. Black leaders failed to see that the Republican Party, the party of abolition and black freedom in the South for a brief period, was also the party of big business and had no long-term commitment to either the rights of labor or even freedom and equality for African Americans. Both labor organizations rapidly waned in size and influence during the 1870s, never realizing their potential. In many cases, a little further down, in many cases, the same military units that had just been withdrawn from the South, ensuring the defeat of Reconstruction at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan, returned to the North to put down the railroad uprising, which will be in a moment. This is what W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP and the preeminent black scholar of the United States ever, says about Reconstruction. Thus, labor went into the Great War of 1877 against Northern capital unsupported by the black man. And the black man went his way in the South to strengthen and consolidate his power, unsupported by Northern labor. Suppose for a moment that Northern labor had stopped the bargain of 1876 and maintained the power of the labor vote in the South, which it did with arms. And suppose that the Negro, with new and dawning consciousness of the demands of labor, as differentiated from the demands of capitalists, had used his vote more specifically for the benefit of white labor, South and North. So you see Du Bois's, and later the historian Eric Foner would say the same thing, that Reconstruction was a crucial point where white and black labor could have linked up, met up. We failed to do, white and black labor failed to do that mostly because of white labor, and they entered the next region, the next era of history in a terribly divided state, and that divided state would continue to exist well into the 1930s and 40s. And this is just what I talked about. The railroad strike of 1877, one historian called it the year of violence. Railroad workers in the panic of 1873. I always like to think about that. What was the panic of 1873? Oh why? I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, whenever I hear that the panic of 1873, they got about a 60% wage cut because of the panic of 1873, and another 10% in early 1877. What happened was the railroad workers went on a massive strike. Went on just a massive strike. Sort of all up and down the Camden, Baltimore line, sort of all over. These protests were marked by extreme violence. The militia came out, fired on the crowds, and this was some of the engravings at the time. Hundreds of thousands of railroad workers were striking at the time. The thing was, when this strike wave started, there was no friendship between white and black labor. So this struggle, this 1877 strike wave, was also at a time when whites and blacks were really separating in terms of their mutual trust for one another, mainly springing from white racism. And the strike wave, it marred by terrible violence, attacks and counterattacks, mostly police violence, but a good deal of striker violence, burned down buildings, and within several days of protests, militias tamped down the strike wave, and sort of life returned to, I hate that phrase, life returned to normal. It never returns to normal quite after that. Labor movement took a fairly big hit there. Now we're sort of rounding up close to the end here. One interesting group that came about during this period was the Knights of Labor, and they're really neat. They're sort of a very early voluntary labor organization that organized workers in all kinds of industries. They were originally one of those secret societies, you know, with those secret handshakes. But then they came out into the open. And what did they aim at? They were aiming at social transformations and moral benefit. They wanted all of society to get basically a form of moral enlightenment. One of its main leaders and spokesman, Terence Powderly, basically saw the factory system as breaking up the dignity and the respect that the tradesman who was able to assemble a whole shoe, assemble a whole shoe at once, now you were just doing little bits and pieces of that, and nobody had any pride in craftsmanship, in workmanship. And the Knights of Labor aimed at fixing sort of this degradation, this alienation of labor. They organized through these local workers' assemblies, sort of in town halls. Very interesting, very populist movement. They're sort of racially ambiguous. There were black members of the Knights of Labor. So they, at this time when racial relations were going south, it's kind of a light of hope. And this is what they were for. They were for political action, sort of protests. They were for worker and producer co-ops, cooperatives, so that the workers and producers could buy and sell together. So this cooperative movement, they were very much against strikes. Only in very, 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 very rare instances did the national sort of Knights of Labor endorse strikes. Sometimes there were what's called a wildcat strike, like our own local would go out on strike. Now next week, Michael Johnston, he's quite an expert in the Knights of Labor. He's going to probably fill you in a lot more. And what he's going to tell you is that Grand Rapids, right, what we think of as maybe, you know, less than a labor mecca, was actually one of the one of the first, Joe, what is it?
One of the first labor cities in the nation.
one of the first labor cities and a sort of a hotbed of the Knights of Labor. So kind of interesting how things change over time. This is an interesting graph I found. Beside it looking like an ice cream cone, what it shows is that the Knights of Labor hovered maybe around 80,000 members nationally, but right around 1885, 1886, they sort of shot up in membership up to close to 800,000 members. And what was happening in 1885 and 1886 was what's called the agitation for the 8-hour day, right? Just to give you some background, previous to this, the standard was somewhere between 10 and 12 hours, right? They had, I believe it was the Philadelphia strike of 1835 achieved a 10-hour working day. And now labor organizations, the Knights of Labor, other trades groups, bricklayers, especially a lot of leather workers unions were in on this. They were advocating for the 8-hour day. And their slogan or their motto was 8 hours for play, or 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what you will. If you do the math, it kind of comes out to 24. But I don't do math, so, you know. So what's happening? As we're approaching the 1880s, so we're approaching mid-1880s and the end of what we're going to be talking about, we have the 8-hour day agitation and the Haymarket riot. And this is this 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Because remember, if you're working 12 hours, if you're working 14 hours, this sleep and this rest, our students might know something about that. That kind of disappears, right? What would that be today? 8 hours for Facebook, 8 hours for Twitter, and about 5 hours of drinking Monster energy drinks, and then 2 hours for sleeping, right? Yes, something like that, right? So there was sort of a nationwide sweep for this 8-hour agitation. 8 hours, 8 hours. It was very strong across trade associations. Finally, the decision was made, and one of the leaders from the Knights of Labor and a future founder of the American Federation of Labor, Sam Gompers, was a really great supporter of this idea of the 8-hour agitation. And they all agreed to meet all across the country in sort of a general strike and protest on May 1st, right? May 1 of 1886, and about 350,000 workers, that would be the equivalent of maybe today 2.5 million, 3 million workers going out in protest, and many were on strike for this 8-hour day agitation, and about 65,000 of them were in Chicago. Chicago was sort of the organizing center of this 8-hour day legislation. Police were of course on the streets. Protesters were attacked. 4 protesters in Chicago were killed. Few days later, a mob, well, I wouldn't say a mob, a group of much more radical laborites assemble in what's called the Haymarket area of Chicago. Now, this is sort of this famous incident. Somebody, it's never been determined who, threw a bomb into a cordon of police. Immediately, 1 died. Later on, 7 others were died. 7 others were to die subsequent to their injuries, and the police attacked and arrested this gathering mob late at night. Some people were killed, and eventually 8 were arrested, and this is the famous sort of Haymarket 8. And who was it? Many of these were immigrants or children of immigrants, many from Germany, because the Germans really brought sort of a radical labor organizing spirit or Geist to the American labor movement. What are their names? They were all arrested and they were all on trial. Their names were August Spies, Albert Parsons, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, Louis Ling, Samuel Felden, Oscar Neebe, and Michael Schwab. They were all indicted, put on trial, and found guilty. All but one were sentenced to death. 4, Spies, Parsons, Engel, and I believe it was Lig, were executed. 1 committed suicide, and several years later, the very progressive governor, Altgeld of Illinois, pardoned the remaining, I believe it was 3. Because new evidence, basically the trial was conducted in a media frenzy. The Haymarket anarchists, the Haymarket, what was the phrase? The Haymarket mayhem, foreign anarchists infiltrate America. So in a media frenzy, the trial was not let's say it would not stand up today because nobody really knows who would have thrown that. It could have been from the protesters. It could have been from something we know as police spies that have definitely been in existence. This is an engraving from the time. Remember, everyone at the time is carrying around guns, right? Even if you're, this is Chicago, remember? Even today, everyone's got a gun in Chicago, right? So this is sort of an engraving at the time. You see the explosion in the back. 8 policemen die. The mob fight and the arrest. Well, what are some of the consequences of this this riot at Haymarket, this failure at Haymarket? Well, the labor movement kind of crumbles. The 8-hour movement crumbles afterwards. But the interesting thing that sort of the inheritance of the world is that this thing we call May Day, May 1st, which is International Workers' Day, in every single country besides the United States. We don't know what it is. We just had our Labor Day. But what the American labor movement did, it kind of divorced itself from the global labor movement, which celebrates May Day. And the American labor movement forgets about that. So the world, think about this, folks. The world celebrates and memorializes an act that happened here in the United States in Chicago, the Haymarket incident. Every country in the world, right? Every labor movement in the world, in Mexico, right? Even all that stuff that those of us who are old enough, remember we watched the May Day, the Soviets, blah, 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 with their missiles. Even that was celebrating Chicago. But if you go to Spain, if you go to France, if you go to Japan, if you go to Mexico, May Day is the International Labor's holiday. And it's because of something that happened here, about less than 200 miles away from here in Chicago in 1886. Very interesting. See how history works? Isn't that fascinating? Everybody celebrates this but us. This is the... That's me. This is me and a rabble-rousing student and a kiddo, not mine, but another friend of ours. When we went to the Haymarket Martyrs grave site in Waldheim Cemetery in Chicago. So that's there. It's kind of a pilgrimage spot for the American labor movement, and I gotta say the American left, and also on the approximate spot where the Haymarket riot occurred, where the bomb was thrown and all of this went down, there's this new monument. I'm forgetting the corner, but in Like right here, there's a really good hot dog place. You know, they'll pick, it's like a Tony Paco's in Toledo, but it's right here. So it's like you can go to the Haymarket Monument and then go get a really great hot dog. Chicago hot dogs, best thing. So there is a Haymarket Monument. It's just not thought about much here. Our labor movement doesn't, you know, teach about this. We don't associate with that because it's supposed to be too radical of a holiday, even though a lot of Chicago unions did support and put money up for that. So, where did I bring us? I brought us to a thrown bomb, some dead German laborites, or dead American German laborites, and some spicy hot dogs. Question is, will labor recover, right? Will it come back from this defeat? You gotta come back and find out next week. Will it recover? Thank you all very much.